are going to be covering the last period of the Israelites in Scripture. There was a period after this one that is sometimes referred to as the silent period of 400 years called the intertestamental times, which some of the Apocrypha cover. Some of that material, we won't be covering that in this class because it's not a part of our canon. What we will cover today is the last period of Israelite history that is given to us in the canon of Scripture. And it is after the Babylonian exile. Remember where we've been for so long. All of the roller coaster sin and rededication, the roller coaster ride of the people that finally came to a breaking point in the fulfillment of prophecy. And Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, and Nebuchadnezzar came in, took the city, destroyed the temple, just blew the city and temple apart, and took the last wave of exiles away. And then we were covering in the last couple sessions the Israelites in exile. Where were they in exile?
Babylonia.
Yeah, in Babylonia, under Nebuchadnezzar. And then we had some of the great prophets. Jeremiah was just before the fall of Jerusalem, and then he stayed after the fall of Jerusalem, remained in the devastated land with the poorest of the poor. And then even he was taken with some fugitives who ran off and disobeyed the word of the Lord into Egypt. And Jeremiah, in the history of Israel, disappears, his ministry disappears with the Israelites who run off to Egypt. And then we have Daniel and Ezekiel, who are in the land of Babylonia, and are ministering to God's people, bringing the word of the Lord, and also ministering to the leaders of Babylon in the city. And they were prophets of the Lord for pagan leaders. And you remember the testimony of the tyrants. Remember the testimonies of the two tyrants. Nebuchadnezzar's testimony of the power of God in his life and his humiliation and his exalting of the Lord. And then the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, who saw the writing on the wall, and that night he was killed. And so the Israelites have been in Babylon, suspended, you could say, recognizing the error of their ways and yet still faltering. And God was faithful to give them prophets to lead them, the priests and prophets. And then the Persian Empire comes in. And this is where we are. This is what begins the last period of Israelite history. And once again, we see God working in the lives of his people, not only through his prophets, who we're going to focus on today, but also through imperial forces of non-Israelite peoples. And we don't like that. That God allows and even uses as his tools non-Israelite, non-biblical, non-covenant people who were pagan peoples and idolatrous peoples to further the purposes that he has for his people. And the Persian kingdom comes in and defeats Babylon with ease under King Cyrus. Do you remember Cyrus? This is not the first time we hear his name. He's the one that inaugurates, through the leading and the blessing of the Lord, without knowing that, although he would have thought it was his gods, so surely would have proclaimed and praised his gods as enabling him to do this. Cyrus comes in and ushers in this final period of biblical history for the Israelites. Where else have we heard Cyrus's name before? It was 200 years before his name was mentioned, strangely and prophetically.
Was it an old?
Isaiah, yeah, good. Isaiah prophesied that a messianic figure would come, a deliverer of God's people. And Cyrus comes in to take Babylon and Babylonia, defeats them with ease. There is a one of those, not a scroll, I forget what it's, the technical term for it is, but those stone records that they would have in the land, in this period. Thank you, cuneiform tablets. Is there another word besides tablet for them, the circular ones?
The circular ones, they're like a hexagonal thing. I can't remember the name.
Yeah.
It's in the old literature book.
And it speaks of his defeating of Babylon without a fight, really. Cyrus comes in, great conqueror, takes the land and does something that some other kings had done, and he wants to, with his new subjects, he wants them to be able to live out their lives under his rule and under the power of the Persian kingdom, but he wants them to be able to carry on their customs and worship their gods. And he wants them to prosper in that way as his subjects under his rule, but in their own cultures and customs. And so he sends a group of the exiles that were in Babylon, the Jews, back into the land and gives them a governor. You remember what his name is? The governor that he gives to the first waves of Israelites that returned to Judah. Starts with a Z. He's one of the prophets, one of the first prophets. Zerubbabel. Yeah. He gives them a governor. Zerubbabel goes in, and as the governor of the people, I'm giving you all this before we read here what's happening. He goes in, and he begins work on the foundation of the temple with the first wave of Israelites that return. And we're told about this in the book of Ezra. Ezra, as one of the leading spiritual leaders of the restoration of the people after they returned from captivity. And in chapter 5 of Ezra, what happens is a new king has come in the Persian Empire. He's back in his homeland. And under Zerubbabel, they're rebuilding. And a local government official from Trans-Euphrates, his name is Tatnai, gets upset that the Israelites are beginning to rebuild their devastated land. He doesn't like that, and he questions them on it, and so he sends a letter to the then king of the Persian kingdom, Darius, King Darius. You remember the prophet who was ministering back in the kingdom to Darius. And now we are back in the land of Judah. And in Ezra chapter 5, we are introduced to two key prophets in this final period of biblical history of the Israelites in the Old Covenant. Zechariah and Haggai come up in the story. And Tatnai, the Trans-Euphrates governor, is upset, and so he asks Darius, I want to know if it's really true that Cyrus gave a decree to these returning exiles to rebuild. Is that really true? Because they're really starting the work, and they're really starting to rebuild their land. And I'm not so sure about this. And he was really wanting to put a stop to it. And so King Darius sets a search party to look through the records, and King Darius finds the letter from Cyrus, the decree from Cyrus, finds the proof, and I want to say puts Tatnai in his place, but it's not that Tatnai was in any way out of line as the governor of Trans-Euphrates, but he keeps the situation going. The Israelites are a bit in suspense there, wondering if they can continue the work in the face of this new enemy near them. And then in chapter 6, we pick up the story. And Laura, if you could read, if you could stand and read to us, chapter 6, the first 15 verses. And this is Darius responding to Tatnai and telling him what to do. And I want you to hear the irony that's in here. Tatnai wanting to put a stop to the rebuilding that the Israelites are doing, and listen what ends up getting decreed for Tatnai from Darius.
Then King Darius issued a decree, and a search was made in the archives, where the treasures were stored in Babylon. And at Agmetha, in the palace that is in the province of Media, a scroll was found, and in it a record was written thus. In the first year of King Cyrus issued a decree concerning in the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where they offered sacrifices, and let the foundations of it be firmly laid. Its height 60 cubits and its width 60 cubits, with 3 rows of heavy stones and 1 row of new timber. Let the expenses be paid from the king's treasury. Also let the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple, which is in Jerusalem, and brought to Babylon, be restored and taken back to the temple which is in Jerusalem, each to its place, and deposit them in the house of God. Now therefore Tattenai, governor of the region beyond the river, and Shethar-Boznai, and your companions, the Persians, who are beyond the river, keep yourselves far from there. Let the work of this house of God alone, let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God on its site. Moreover, I issue a decree as to what you shall do for the elders of these Jews, for the building of this house of God. Let the cost be paid at the king's expense from taxes on the region beyond the river, that is to be given immediately to these men, so that they are not hindered. And whatever they need, young bulls, rams, and lambs for the burnt offerings of the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, and oil, according to the request of the priests who are in Jerusalem, let it be given them day by day without fail, that they may offer sacrifices of sweet aroma to the God of heaven, and pray for the life of the king and his sons. Also I issue a decree that whoever alters this edict, let a timber be pulled from his house and erected, and let him be hanged on it, and let his house be made a refuse heap because of this. And may the God who causes his name to dwell there destroy any king or people who put their hand to alter it, or to destroy this house of God which is in Jerusalem. I, Darius, issue a decree, let it be done diligently. Then Tattenai, governor of the region beyond the river, Shethar-Boznai, and their companions diligently did according to what King Darius had said. So the elders of the Jews built, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. And they built and finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the commandment of Cyrus, Darius, and how do you say that?
Artaxerxes.
Okay, king of Persia. Now the temple was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, which was in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius.
Thank you, Laura. What an amazing story. It's amazing, the turn of events. Can someone summarize what happens here? Tatnai wants to, hoping to halt the work, hoping that the Israelites are lying, and that he can get them to stop this rebuilding of power. And Darius, what happens here? Can someone summarize for us?
It makes a law that they can't stop it.
Yeah. He finds the decree of Cyrus, and he reissues the decree to Tatnai. Let the building go on. And he tells Tatnai, and uses some very forceful language, which was typical of these kings and rulers. Keep your hands off. Stay away from those Israelites. Don't mess with them. And I have to believe that through these words you are hearing the heart of God for his people. What he really wants. How many times has he already blessed and prospered his people strangely through foreign leaders. And here, once again, you have Darius saying, don't mess with the Israelites. And then he takes it even further. What does he do next? He reissues the decree, and then what is he? And then he says in verse 8, moreover, what? Matthew, it's on the tip of your tongue.
Basically says, you mess with them, I'm gonna hang you. That's what it says.
Right. Oh yeah. And that was typical of their decrees and laws. There was nothing shocking about that, but that meant this is serious business. I'm not kidding around. I mean, just before he said those, closing the deal with that harsh threat like that, society outside of covenant with God and the unity and the bond of the Spirit that operate and how society operates. And so, but he says in verse 8, moreover, not only are you to, don't bother them, leave them alone. I want you to go in and take out of the treasury everything they need. Pay for whatever they need, bring in all the supplies, make sure that the abundance of the provisions they needed is there, and it's your job to ensure that it gets done in that way. I just love when these things turn out like this. And then he closes with what Matthew said, that you will be, if you fail to do this, or if anyone, they will be impaled from a beam from their own house. So just, just leaves it with a shocker there. Yeah.
Why wasn't the command followed when Cyrus first decreed it, and why did it have to be followed?
Why wasn't it, you mean why weren't they done yet?
Yeah, in the first year of King Cyrus issued a decree, but that was lost in wherever they found it from, in the treasuries, which were stored in Babylon. Why wasn't that followed before now?
Yeah, well, we'll get to, when we get to Haggai, there is a reason, at least on the Israelites' side, why things were delayed. So it wasn't just enemy forces and opponents and people that didn't like them that were causing the delay, although that was something that needed to be dealt with. Later on, it causes a big halting. This isn't the only time that they're opposed. But there was also an Israelite side to this story, and they were doing something wrong that was delaying the rebuild.
I mean, like,
And the restoration.
did King Darius know that his slave workforce was supposed to be free already based on a previous king's decree? And was he ignoring that, or did he just, oh, look at that, I forgot they're supposed to be free?
Oh, you mean the Israelites in exile?
Yeah.
Or I mean that he had sent back, that
Yeah.
Cyrus had, I would just say in the bigness of the Medo-Persian kingdom,
Just
that had taken over all of that area, there were so many peoples and so many cultures that he didn't know the whole story. He didn't have so obviously he didn't know all of Cyrus's decrees. So I guess you could say that the next king in line didn't get a download of the whole. Right, that's a good question. Why in these pretty sophisticated societies here, why didn't they have that kind of a record? So, yeah, so there was a gap there of information that was filled in for him after he sent a search out. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Cyrus, or Darius, in the typical fashion of these kings, Persian kings, wanted the blessing of the gods of each of the cultures. They were very pluralistic and believed that there was truth, to a certain degree, in all of the religions and faiths. That doesn't sound very ancient, does it? No. You probably have friends that believe that. Well, it's really all the same God. We all have same universal destiny, the universe is in control and things like that. That's not just ancient thinking, that's not just contemporary postmodern thinking. This kind of thing has been around for a long time. And so what Darius did, and what Cyrus did, and others, is he says it right in here, that he wants the blessing of this God. And he wants the Israelites to pray to their God for him and for his rule, because he believes that if he blesses the other cultures and faiths and peoples, that then he will in return receive a blessing. And God is working through that for the Israelites and giving them the promised fulfillment of this partial deliverance that they're receiving. And so this is very interesting to see that Darius is calling upon Tatnai to give them freedom, and one of the reasons here in chapter 6 is so that they will pray to their God, the God of heaven, he calls him, so that he will be blessed and his kingdom will be blessed. Very interesting. And then so the rebuilding takes place, the temple is completed, and now another wave of Israelites is sent out of Persia back to the homeland of Israel, into Jerusalem. And this is where Ezra, whose book we are in, comes in. So Ezra is not in the picture with the returning exiles in the homeland until we get to chapter 7, after the rebuild of the temple is completed, and then Ezra arrives. So let's talk about Ezra in the book that we are in here. And we'll just look at this information, and if you have any questions, let me know. Ezra, his name means helper. He was a priest and a scribe, and returned to Judah after the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Jewish tradition holds that Ezra wrote the book of Ezra. That's the most obvious one. But you may not know that tradition holds that he is also the author of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and possibly even Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah, which we'll look at in a few minutes, was written separately from Ezra as a separate document, but very early on in the tradition of the Jews and in their faith, they joined the two together as one document. And for a long time, Ezra and Nehemiah were one completed book, and we have them again as two separate books. So it's reliable tradition that Ezra is the author of these things. And when he returned, it's very likely that when he arrived on the scene, the temple was rebuilt, there was a new beginning, with a big gap in the spiritual life of the people, needing to be led, needing a wise and focused leader. It's very likely that he used 1st and 2nd Chronicles to reroot them in the history of their faith, who they are, and what God has done for them. And so we have Ezra as the author of those things. The book of Ezra covers about 79 years of time. Ezra tells of two groups of Israelites returning from Babylon after 70 years of captivity, the prophesied 70 years of captivity. The first return under Zerubbabel, who was from the line of David, was when they began to rebuild the temple. That was up through chapter 6. 49,697 people were sent back. The second group, which came with Ezra, was 57 years later. There was 1,758 priests and Levites, leaders, spiritual leaders, come to restore true spiritual life to the people. I want to show you this slide here that has a timeline, and remember you can download this on the info page so you can look at this. We have a timeline here, or at least a stage of what happens with some of these dates. Scholars are very sure about, some they're not quite so sure, but this is pretty close here. You have 3 returns, 3 waves of coming back out of exile. The first one is under the leadership of Zerubbabel, the governor, placed over the Israelites, and they rebuild the temple. And this is when we are introduced to Haggai and Zechariah, who we will look at in a little bit. 2 prophets, 2 books in the scripture. And then this next wave, beginning in Ezra chapter 7, is when Ezra comes, and we have Zerubbabel building the physical structure of the temple. Concerned about spiritual things, but his work was the physical structure. Ezra comes in with other spiritual leaders and reforms the people through spiritual leadership, concerned about the spiritual condition. Certainly would have been concerned and happy about the temple, but his main call and concern was the spiritual condition of the people. And in between this time, and we'll look at this, scholars believe is when Esther, the book of Esther, was authored in between these two returns. And we have a gap of 12 years, and Nehemiah comes, and he rebuilds his work, and it did not go smoothly for him, and nor did it for any of them, is to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, the defenses, because they were being molested by opponents and enemies who got to the point under Nehemiah that they were threatening to wage war against the Israelites. And so really they haven't been back that long. For us, it's a lifetime, these years, but in the history of the Israelites and as far as the generations go, they've really just returned and had a couple generations back in the homeland, and already their enemies comes to a point of threatening them with war because of Nehemiah's persistent leadership. So what should Nehemiah have done under that kind of thing? We'll get to that. What should he have done? And that's when we come to Aaron's Italian prophet, Malachi, right? Malachi. And also the last book in the scripture, who scholars believe, some scholars believe he was the last prophet of the biblical record. Some believe that it was Joel, and there's good reasons that it could be Joel, but both of them prophesy things that are building an anticipation, the anticipation of the coming of the Lord and the fulfillment of prophecy and the outpouring of the Spirit. Both Malachi and Joel have that kind of culminating anticipation, and you see them coming right towards the edge of the end of the Old Testament. They didn't know that, but they were highly anticipating the coming of the Lord and the new covenant, which we'll get to next semester. Okay, so there's a little picture there, and that's Professor Edwards. That comes from his material that he had built. Great picture of the waves of the return. The first return of Israelites, we're jumping back before Ezra arrives, but this is Ezra's record. He was the historian for us, under Zerubbabel's leadership. King Cyrus of Persia allows the captive children of Israel to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. This is direct fulfillment of prophecy in Isaiah 44:28 and 45, 1 through 4 and 13, which speaks of Cyrus, of a coming leader named Cyrus, who would do all of this in 700 BC. And he was a messianic figure for the people of Israel. Ezra chapter 3. When the children of Israel return to Jerusalem, their first act is an act of dedication and a sacrifice of thanksgiving to the Lord. Immediately they begin reorienting themselves to their faith in Yahweh in a way that they had not been able to do all during the time of their exile. Ezra chapter 3, starting verse 10. After being in Jerusalem 1 year, they laid the foundation of the temple. And this is where Tatnai came in, the passage we were talking about. The adversaries of Israel are upset that Judah is rebuilding the temple, so they send letters to the new king, and he stops the work for 14 years. And then we come to the completion of the temple through Darius's decree and the arrival of Ezra. Ezra chapter 5. After 14 years of inactivity, the Lord raises up the prophets Haggai and Zechariah to encourage the people to complete the work of the temple and restore true worship in Israel. The people were lagging in their work because of opponents, which is discouraging. And there's so much of a picture in Ezra and Nehemiah of the way that enemies of God's people influence the people of God to halt the mission of God. There's such a picture here. And their intimidation was discouraging, but then also Haggai turns a light on to something going on among the Israelites. They had a problem, and it was partly their fault that they were delaying the work, and we'll look at that. The Lord raised up prophets to get the work going again. And the ministry of the prophets was effective, and it stirred Zerubbabel to lead the people. And so the temple is completed. Chapter 6, 1 through 12, King Darius finds the commands, the decree. We talked about that at length. And they rebuild the temple. And Tatnai ends up, instead of stopping them, ends up having to make sure that everything is fully financed and that they're just super blessed people. Chapter 7. Ezra returns with a group of priests and Levites 57 years later, and he begins to teach the people. Nehemiah, later on, sheds light on this, that Ezra was a teacher of the people. He was explaining the word to them. He was teaching the people the word, and they were now receiving teaching, and it was reforming them and reestablishing them in the ways of God and in the law. And we have Zerubbabel addressing the physical state of the temple, and we have the governor and Ezra coming in addressing the spiritual condition of the people and their relationship to God. So we see God working in this time. Let's talk about Haggai and Zechariah. Two prophets that come in during this time, just before Ezra arrives on the scene. Very important spiritual leaders that were a part of building strength into Zerubbabel's leadership and Ezra's leadership. Haggai returned. And we're also covering here very quickly these short books. We're looking at the person and the book in this brief little glimpse here. Haggai, the prophet, returned from Babylon with Zerubbabel, and he may have witnessed the earlier destruction of Solomon's temple. So in Ezra's account, Haggai is one. This is Babylon here, and here's Jerusalem over here. And in Ezra, Haggai is here, and he has come back with Zerubbabel. And tradition holds that Haggai was an old man at the time of this ministry that he had. And his ministry in Ezra is, in what we have from the book of Haggai, is a short ministry. And the book of Haggai covers a period of only 4 months when he gave a series of prophetic messages and really preaching a prophetic message to the people. And it is possible, as an old man, that he had been in Jerusalem back before the exile and witnessed the ministry of Jeremiah and Zedekiah's rebellion and Nebuchadnezzar's conquering of the city and destruction of the temple. And then he ends up in exile, and now he is sent back to with the people to assist Zerubbabel as a prophet of the Lord. And he gives these messages and stirs the people, and the Spirit of the Lord works through him to get them reoriented. And I want to talk here now. This is where we get the problem of the Israelites' side of the delay in rebuilding the temple. Part of Haggai's call, in addition to Zerubbabel, was to say, finish the work, rebuild the temple. And Haggai, as a prophet of the Lord, is speaking to the heart of the issue in the people, not just the intimidation of the enemies that was scaring them and was threatening to halt the work, and it had halted it for a time. But we have from Haggai chapter 1, verses 2 through 11, a little window into what the Israelites were doing wrong. Haggai 1:2. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come for the Lord's house to be built. Really? Isn't that what Cyrus told them to do? The ungodly king of Persia told them to go back and rebuild. And now God's own people are quickly falling away already, saying, no, we don't need to do that right now. Then the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses, while while this house remains a ruin? Now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. You have planted much, but have harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. Haggai was saying, the reason you are struggling as you are struggling, you are back in the homeland. God wants to reestablish you and prosper you. And Haggai was saying the reason you are suffering and not prospering is because you are ignoring the work that you are to be doing, which is the rebuilding the temple of the Lord. Verse ways. Go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build the house, so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. You expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Why? Declares the Lord Almighty. Because of my house, which remains a ruin. Hear these words right here. While each of you is busy with his own house. Do you hear the comparison here? What's going on? What are they doing? What are the people doing now that they're back in the land? He makes a comparison. Haggai speaks the word of the Lord and makes a comparison. They have neglected the rebuilding of the temple, but they have been building. They have been establishing themselves, and they have been seeking to prosper and start over, but they have been doing it only on their own end, in their own territory, you could say, and in their own homes. They're doing what comes naturally to all of us. To be concerned about me, myself, and I, and my camp, my part, my stuff, my life. Is it bad to be concerned about where you're going to live and the house you're going to live in and want your house to be fixed up and in good condition? Is that a bad thing? No. No. We should be concerned about those things, but they were doing it at the expense of the house of the Lord, and they were leaving it in a pile of rubble while they were rebuilding their own. Verse 10. Therefore, because of you, the heavens have withheld their dew, and the earth its crops. I called for a drought on the fields, and the mountains on the grain, the new wine, the oil, and whatever the ground produces, on men and cattle, and on the labor of your hands. So Haggai is giving a tough word here. There has been a drought in the land, Israelites, and you're suffering and you're not prospering because you have ignored the work of rebuilding the house of God. You have been concerned only about your own house. And so Haggai's book, that's the first chapter, and then we have one more chapter. So you get 2 bits from Haggai, from his ministry of 4 months among the people. The first word is a word of correction and rebuke, and the second chapter, Haggai chapter 2, is a message of encouragement regarding the power of the Spirit upon God's obedient people. First chapter, rebuke, straighten yourselves out, be concerned about the work of the Lord. Chapter 2, if you obey the word of the Lord, the power of the Spirit will enable you to complete the work. And Zerubbabel was touched by Haggai's ministry, and the Lord used that, his preaching. And under Zerubbabel's leadership, with the compelling word of Haggai, Zerubbabel leads the people to complete the rebuilding of the temple. And then we come to the book of Zechariah, also a prophet with the returning exiles at this time in the homeland. Zechariah was a contemporary of Haggai. He was a Levite and a prophet, and he was probably very young when he came back into the homeland. So we have Haggai, the old prophet, returning with a very short ministry, at least at this stage of his life. And then we have Zechariah coming in with a very long ministry among the people there. Zechariah, the book of Zechariah, is the most messianic book in the whole of the Old Testament, even for a short book. And it is quoted 41 times in the New Testament. The theme of the future Messiah, who will rule the whole world, is given as a basis for highlighting the significance of their present work of rebuilding the temple and faith under their difficult circumstances. Zechariah contains 8 visions and 4 messages given to encourage the people that God is their hope for the future. Zechariah's prophetic ministry to the people was that this work that and I'm summarizing, this work that you are doing now is preparing the way for the coming of the Lord. Though the temple you are building now is not like the glory of Solomon's temple that was destroyed, because it was a much lesser temple, the new one that they built. And some of the people that knew the Solomon's temple glory were upset and wept when they saw the new temple, when they made the comparison. They were so upset at how much it lacked in comparison, they wept, and it was discouraging. And Zechariah says, what you are doing now is so significant that the Messiah himself, the great deliverer, the anointed one, the Son of God, will walk inside of this temple. That's how significant what you're doing is. So keep up the work, because God is preparing you for the coming of the Messiah. Yes, Hannah.
If a few generations went by, then how could the people have known what Solomon's temple was like?
It wouldn't have been a few generations. Let's see here. We would need to look at the timeline. And I don't have that with me. So we have a verse, and I'm trying to think where it is, that says when the people saw the temple, they wept in comparison. Yeah, Matthew.
Well, you were saying some of the older prophets would have witnessed the temple's destruction, so wouldn't they have known what it looked like?
It's possible that Haggai did. It's possible. Yeah.
And I guess what I'm asking, were there people who had seen the temple with their own eyes, or did they just know about its splendor?
Yeah, that's an important question. Hannah, I would want to look at that, and with the dates that we have. Haggai gives us some good dates. There are differences of opinion with scholars with the dates preceding this, how much in between. So, yeah.
Judah had only been in exile for 70 years.
Mm-hmm.
So between the destruction of the temple and when they came back, there was only 70 years. So let's say someone was 10, they would have remembered the temple, and they would have been 80 when they came back and the temple was rebuilt.
Old for
Yeah.
that time.
Yeah, 80's old, but you
Right.
can still remember it. There is that one quote where it said the older people who remembered the temple. So
Yeah,
even
wept.
I don't remember. I think it's in Ezra, but even then, there were enough people that you could. The noise, I guess, was loud enough that between the shouts of joy and the wailing, the noise could be heard for miles. So there must have been a significant group of people who remembered the old temple.
The young generation was so excited about the new temple, the new thing that God was doing, you could say. And then the older generation who knew the former glory, that broke their heart in comparison. So, Hannah, I think something that's important in that is that the rebuilding of the temple was early in the return, relatively early. And then later on, much later really as far as a lifetime goes, is Nehemiah and the walls of the city, and then the rebuilding of the city. So we have the temple happening early on. Yeah. So you could have still had some old people that were a part of the days of the fall of Jerusalem. Jeremiah and Zedekiah and Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah, Maria.
And also, Ezra was teacher, right? So he
Mhm.
was teaching the people in Babylon about, like the scriptures. So maybe, I don't know if that's right.
Yeah, it's certainly likely that he was an influencer of God's people and being sent back for that reason, to carry on the work of their traditions and their customs, you know, from the perspective of Persia. So, yeah, he could have been speaking to them about what once was. Is that what you mean, Maria?
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe the ways of the Lord, or also what they had under Solomon, or under Solomon's temple. If anyone finds that passage, let us know where that is. You got it, Sean?
Ezra 3:12.
What was that?
Ezra 3:12.
Ezra 3:12. Let's look at that. Go ahead and read that.
But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy.
Thank you. Yeah, there it is. That they had seen, it wasn't just their memory or what they had heard, but they had seen it. So, good. Good, that brings the story together for us. All right, did I miss any questions? No? Okay. And then we come a little later on to Nehemiah. We have the book of Nehemiah. We want to talk about his book, but also Nehemiah as a leader. He is often used as a picture of a good, godly leader. He made some mistakes, but he did a lot of good things, and he gives us principles. He was very important because he was there to rebuild the defenses. And we'll talk about his leadership. Nehemiah, his name means comforter. He returns 12 years after the book of Ezra, after the period of Ezra, and 90 years after the first return and the rebuilding of the temple. So we have the exiles come back before Ezra, under Zerubbabel's leadership, with the ministry of the Haggai and Zechariah. They rebuild the temple. Ezra arrives, teaches the people, and the other Levites and priests are there, and they reestablish the people in their worship of the Lord and in the ways of God. The temple ministry is going on, but now enemies are getting at them. They're upset and coming at them, and they are a defenseless people. Their temple's there, the people are there, and there's no wall. And Nehemiah hears from his relative that the land is laying in rubble, and so he comes 90 years after the rebuilding of the temple. Back in Persia, he was King Artaxerxes' cupbearer, which was like a personal secretary and a counselor to the king. Nehemiah returns to rebuild the walls in the city. The people have been under constant attack from their enemies and have little or no protection. In Nehemiah's book, we have keys, pictures of spiritual leadership. This book is great for these. Spiritual warfare. If you look at it as a picture of these things, it was physical for Nehemiah, although it involved spiritual things, because Nehemiah was a man of prayer. And spiritual restoration and intercession. The work of a spiritual leader we find in Nehemiah. Let's talk about his leadership and the calling of Nehemiah. We see a number of effective leadership characteristics in chapter 1 through 6, and chapter 2, 1 through 11. Here's just some of the points we get out of Nehemiah's life that is a picture of good leadership to us. He allowed his personal life to be interrupted by the needs of the people of God. Nehemiah, serving Artaxerxes, a stable position, you could say. in the land of Persia, and he hears about the devastation of his own people in the homeland, and his heart is stirred, and he is willing to inconvenience his life and greatly interrupt his life to serve the needs of the people of God. And that is an interruption that the Christian leader is going to find him or herself being called to. Have any of you already experienced that? You feel like your role as a leader in some ministry or group was sometimes an interruption to your life? Yeah. And I don't think the Lord sees it that way. He bathed the situation in prayer. He was a leader that knew to take these things to God in prayer, not just his own mind and his own plans. He bathed the situation in prayer. And we have that right there in the scripture. And then he made plans to act in the situation. He was a go leader, but he prayed first, gave it to God, and then he made plans to act. Said something needs to be done. Leif Anderson, who is the president of the National Association of Evangelicals and former pastor of a real influential church in Minnesota, the founder of a church planting movement, says, leaders are people who get things done. That's an easy to remember definition of leadership, isn't it? They get things done. And he made plans to act. And then he submitted his vision to proper authority. Uh-oh. There's an important call of the leader. Sometimes the dreams that God puts in your heart, the plans and the steps of action that he gives need to be submitted to the proper authority if they are involved in the situation or need to be involved. And certainly with Nehemiah, he was a servant of Artaxerxes, and he needed to submit that to Artaxerxes. I'm not saying that you have to submit your plans to the President of the United States, but to the leaders that are local to your situation or should be involved locally in your situation, it's important that they're a part of that. Some more principles of Nehemiah's leadership. So the picture and example he gives us. He carefully planned his work. You get that from what he tells us that he did. He was very careful, he was prayerful, and he was careful about what he did. And he considered the proper time to make things known. He had some pretty radical ideas for the people. He had some real visionary plans that God was birthing in his heart, and he had a sense that they would not be popular with some people. And so Nehemiah chapter 2 tells us that he didn't make his plans known all at once. He didn't blab the whole thing in front of everybody and say, these are all the things I'm going to do for God. And there's a time to make the vision known. It also says he went out at night. So he was actually, for him, in the tension and in the political situation, the sensitivity of what was going on with the enemies around them, he knew he needed to be very careful. And we see that paying attention. Where do I need to be careful? He was taking great care. He set everyone to work with a weapon in one hand and a tool in the other hand. Because of the threats that they had, he had a people that were prepared to fight for their work. Physically, for Nehemiah, physically they needed to be prepared. They had a weapon with them. They were ready while they were working. And that is a great picture to us of God's people who need to be ready and always knowing that there is an enemy out against us. Nehemiah wasn't discouraged by opposition, and he had great opposition, but he trusted God to help him overcome it. And he used wisdom in his interactions with those who were opposed to his efforts. Let me just say that sometimes, as you go about your serving of the Lord in the body of Christ and in the community, and you're meeting community leaders, sometimes you'll meet other Christian leaders who don't share your view on something, or may even set out to stop you, even if they shouldn't. You don't attack people. Your job is not to attack them or to ruin their reputation or and you can't always close them out of the picture. But what we see with Nehemiah is that the Lord gave him wisdom. He was very wise in his interaction, and he was thinking, and he was careful in those relationships, and he saw through the lies that some of the opponents had. And there needs to be wisdom for God's people when they interact with people where there's tension or there's conflict there. And that just happens in ministry. Conflict comes to Christian leaders. Couple more here. He boldly persisted in the word God had given him despite the intimidating threats coming against him from the enemies. It came to the point that Sanballat and Tobiah, who are the names of the enemies, sent a letter out to people and made sure that Nehemiah got a copy. Said, if you don't, spiritual manipulation, came to the point that he said, if you don't stop, we are going to amass an army and we are going to come and kill you right in the middle of your work on the walls. We're going to kill you. Took the ultimate threat. And Nehemiah refused to back down. And he prayed over the conflict. So we see a great example of a bold but careful leader who walked in faith. Oh my goodness, we have some things to get through here. The book of Esther. The book of Esther, very, very quickly. Her name means star, and she certainly was a bright, shining star of God's deliverance to her people. The book is written during a time between Zerubbabel's return to Jerusalem and Ezra's return, early on in this period. Haman is the enemy in Ezra. He was an Agagite, and he was of the family of King Agag of the Amalekites, who are the historical enemies of Israel. For centuries, they had been arch enemies of Israel, and they're a picture of those who come and try to stop the work of God and try to stop the people of God. And here they come up in Esther's story, the infamous Amalekites. Esther is the only Old Testament book not to mention the name of God or the Lord. You do not have a mention of the name of God or the name of the Lord. You only have a mention that Esther fasted, but it doesn't even say that she prayed. And there's a lot of discussion about that, a lot of views on why that is. But what you find is that implied in the book of Esther, by way of implication, the teaching that comes through Esther is that God's favor is on his people, and he is working sovereignly behind the scenes. Even when it's not real clear what he's doing, he's working behind the scenes to fulfill his plan and his promises for his people. Okay, moving on to our Italian prophet, Malachi. He's not Italian. Malachi. His name means my messenger, and for that reason, some scholars have said that that may not even be the name of a person, but that may just be a title to the book whenever you see that word, because it means my messenger. But the way that it's used, there's good reason to think that it was actually his name, Malachi. He ministered with Nehemiah during the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. The Jews had grown discouraged by the delay in fulfillment of God's ultimate promises about his coming and the restoration of the glory of Israel, and they had fallen back into sin. Again, there was anticipation that the Anointed One was coming. The Lord was going to set up his kingdom and rule the whole world, and he was going to overthrow all of his enemies through the Messiah, and it was delayed. The fulfillment was delayed. And they fell back into sin. And God raised up Malachi. He rebukes the people and corrects them for their sin. And then the book closes out with the great expectations and promises from God. Look at some of these here very quickly in Malachi. Chapter 3 and 4. The Lord will send a messenger, Elijah. A type of Elijah will come just before the coming of the Messiah. Does anyone know who that Elijah type was?
John the Baptist.
John the Baptist, yeah. And we're not that far. We're just, about 400 years from this time. Malachi chapter 4, the Messiah will come and heal and protect his people. So we have this anticipation that the Messiah is coming very soon. Very soon he will be here in the history of God's people. Malachi ministered 100 years after the return of Judah from captivity. He may have been the last Old Testament prophet until John the Baptist 400 years later, which is the intertestamental period when we have that in the silence of Scripture, it's sometimes called. In our canon, the silent period. So Malachi closes out the history of God's people. They have come back into the land, and their work of rebuilding a lesser temple, though it was lesser, the encouragement of the Lord coming through the prophets was, your work is very significant. You are reestablishing the faith and the people in the temple to prepare the way for the coming of the Messiah.
Amen.
And that finishes us out in our tracking of the Israelites in the New Testament. Anybody have any questions? All right.